Isaiah chapter 2 is clearly a messianic psalm, a vision of the coming kingdom. The word which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. And remember, he emphasized that in the very beginning. The vision of Isaiah the son of Amoz, chapter 1, concerning Judah and Jerusalem, which he saw during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, the kings of Judah. So here it again is emphasizing that it's concerning Judah and Jerusalem, and those things which would befall them in the latter days. It will come about that in the last days. Now, we have to understand something here. There are many who believe we're in the last days today, but Hebrews says they were in the last days. And James says they were in the last days as well. And even John said they were in the last hour. It was near. Now, this is saying here in the Old Covenant, 700 years before the writer of Hebrews said they were in the last days. This is saying it will come to pass in the last days, indicating that here, 700 years before Christ, it was not the last days yet. And yet there are still people, even though the writer of Hebrews in the first century said they were in the last days, here we are 2,000 years later, people saying we're in the last days. Well, if Isaiah couldn't say he was in the last days 700 years, how can we say we're in the last days 2,000 years after the writers of the New Testament declared they were in the last days? So this is what would take place in the last days. Joel says this too, and Peter says it was fulfilled in Acts chapter 2. It will come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. And this is speaking about the church, Christ building the church upon the rock, Zion, and will be raised above the hills. That is the prideful people, okay? All those who trusted in self-righteousness. And all nations will stream into it. And this is the fulfillment of Gentiles coming into the gates of the city. And many people will come and say, "Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob." So he clearly says that the mountain of the Lord is the house of the God of Jacob. And the Bible says we are the house of God, the Father's house, in which are many mansions, dwelling places, which is us. We are the mansions and dwelling places, as we've studied before. That he may teach us concerning his ways. The Bible says they will all be taught of God. And 1 John declares that that is now fulfilled in us, as well as Hebrews chapters 8 through 10. That he may teach us concerning his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion. This is the new law of Christ. And the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So it goes forth from Zion. This is the gospel going forth out of the church, which Ezekiel chapter, I believe it's 47, speaks of the rivers flowing out of the throne, going into the nations. And so that throne is Jerusalem, the temple of God, which is his church, that dispenses the leaves of the tree for the healing of nations, Revelation 22. The law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he will judge between the nations, and he will render decisions for many peoples, and they will hammer their swords into plowshares. And I believe Micah says the same thing. They shall not learn war anymore. They will hammer their swords into plowshares. In other words, indicating that it is about a fruitful field. It is about harvest. It's about gathering and life as opposed to killing and destruction. They will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. What a beautiful passage. They will not learn war anymore. Come, O house of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord. So that's clearly Jesus who said, I am the light of the world. Jesus said to the city of God, which we are, you are a city set up on a hill, let your light so shine. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. He said, you are the light of the world. For you have abandoned your people, the house of Jacob, because they are filled with influences from the east, and they are soothsayers like the Philistines, and they strike bargains with the children of foreigners. Their land has been filled with silver and gold, and there's no end to their treasures. He's just speaking about the sinfulness and the idolatry of Israel. And as she trusted in her self-righteousness, all these other things were going on. The land has been filled with idols. There's no end to their chariots. They trust in nations. They trust in war. They trust in their swords and their spears. They worship the work of their hands. That is their self-righteousness, what they produce according to the law of Moses. That which their fingers have made. So the common man has been humbled. The man of importance has been abased. But do not forgive them. Enter the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty. We remember the Bible says they will call on the rocks to fall upon them, saying, hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. Why? He would come to destroy them. The proud look of man will be abased and the loftiness of man will be humbled. Peter says that. The proud shall be abased, but the humble will be exalted. So the loftiness of man will be humbled and the Lord will be exalted in that day. Philippians chapter 2, which says, therefore God also has highly exalted him and given him a name which is above every name. For the Lord of hosts will have a day of reckoning against everyone who is proud and lofty, that is, those who trust in their self-righteousness, and against everyone who is lifted up, that he may be abased. And it will be against all the cedars of Lebanon that are lofty and lifted up. We're frequently referred to as trees throughout the scriptures, both believers, God's people, and the enemies of God. And against all the oaks of Bashan, and against the lofty mountains. Again, mountains represents pride. Every mountain will be brought low and every valley exalted. That means the proud brought low, the humble, poor in spirit, broken of all their self-righteousness. No, they do not trust in it. They are resigned to that self-righteousness and have submitted themselves, Romans 9, to the righteousness of God. Against all the lofty mountains, against all the hills that are lifted up, against every high tower, against every fortified wall, against all the ships of Tarshish, against the beautiful craft, the pride of man will be humbled. And so that was fulfilled, of course, in the first century. And the pride of man will be humbled, the loftiness of men abased, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. A repeat of verse 11. Verse 18, but their idols will completely vanish, and men will go into the caves and the rocks, into the holes of the ground before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty when he arises to make the earth tremble through the Roman armies. That would take place. In that day, very important, in that day when the Lord is exalted and this destruction takes place, men will cast away the moles and the bats, their idols of silver and their idols of gold, which they made for themselves to worship. That is how God regarded their sacrifices, as if they were bats. He says, he that sacrifices an ox as if he killed a dog, and he accused them of eating swine's flesh and drinking mice, broth of mice and swine. Now, of course, they would say, no, we didn't do that. God's saying, that's how I regard it. You are Sodom. You are Gomorrah, as we saw in Isaiah 1, our last chapter. In order to go into the caverns and the rocks, the clefts of the cliffs, before the terror of the Lord, the splendor of his majesty, when he arises to make the earth tremble, stop regarding man, whose breath of life is in his nostrils. For why should he be esteemed? Oh, what a shredding of the power and nature of man. Stop regarding man. We're so into that, even in our culture. Well, the Pharisaic culture of the first century, all they did was trust in their righteousness. And Jesus says, stop regarding man. Stop trusting man. Stop trusting chariots. Stop trusting works, self-righteousness, your military power. And in a secondary application, this is so true of America today. We have placed our trust in military might. We have placed our trust in politicians, in rich men and women, in CEOs, in gadgets. We've placed our trust in so many things, and particularly for salvation. We live in an era where in a supposed evangelical church is trusting in Jesus, and yet works and will and self-centeredness and narcissism and individualism characterizes the church. Money characterizes the church rather than the gospel and the love of Christ and mercy characterizing the church. So that's Isaiah chapter 2. I hope you enjoyed it.